Well, welcome back after that brief morning tea. The committee is in a much better mood following a bit of coffee and morning tea. Could I welcome the Australian Institute of Building Surveyors, and starting with you, Mr. Mace, if each of you could give your name, the position in which you're appearing today, and then take either an oath or an affirmation.
Okay. Brett Mace, Chief Executive, Australian Institute of Building Surveyors. I swear that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So help me God.
Mr. Tuxford.
Thank you. Timothy Tuxford. I'm the New South Wales ACT Director of the Australian Institute of Building Surveyors.
Thank you.
I swear that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So help me God.
Thank you. And Mr. Hardy and Mr. Marinelli, I know that you're appearing here in your capacity representing the Association of Accredited Certifiers. So, thank you.
Thank you. My name's Craig Hardy. I'm the President of the Association of Accredited Certifiers, and I swear that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So help me God.
Robert Marinelli. I'm Vice President of the Association of Accredited Certifiers, and I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you all, and thank you both for your submissions. Now, do either or both of your organisations wish to make a brief opening statement?
I'd like to, if that's okay.
You start, Mr. Hardy.
For more than 15 years, the Association has been arguing for greater accountability in the construction sector. For well over 2 decades, governments of all stripes have failed to do a lot about this, in our view. Back in 2002, the New South Wales Joint Select Committee on Quality of Buildings, chaired by Dave Kimmel, investigated the same kinds of issues, which I personally made a submission in April of that year that expressed some of my concerns and, amongst other things, drew attention to the quality of these buildings. And a fundamental keystone of that submission was that the issues of accountability and transparency were key to the successful failure of this industry. Despite a string of reports, this one in 2002, then Multiborough in 2013 and Lambert in 2015 and Sheargold Weir 2018, these issues still exist. Therefore, we hold the view that it's hard to come to any other conclusion that all governments, successive governments and relevant ministers have been asleep at the wheel while this has happened for the last 20 years. We think the terms of reference for this particular issue are narrowly focused on private certification when it is a wider issue on the building system overall. The key to all of this, as I mentioned just previously, was ensuring that accountability of all practitioners currently involved in this process is fundamental. And it's partially the reason why we have this issue now with insurance and professional indemnity insurance generally. We think that accountability is necessary right across the sector. It's critical that all people that participate in the process of construction are accountable for what they do, but in a manner where it's transparent so we can see what they've done. Just a few things I'd like to make clear regarding more recent events, things like the Opal Tower. Comments of those investigation reports that while it was not within this, and I'll quote, while it was not within the scope of our review to look closely at certifications that took place on Opal Tower, we found no evidence that the building certifiers had been deficient in regards to statutory expectations. Regarding Mascot, it's been reported quite widely that has not been reported quite widely. There was actually a council, not a private certifier, that's involved in the certification of their buildings. And the third point I'd like to make is that regarding council certifiers and private certifiers, I just want to make it clear that payment structure is the same. Council certifiers, like private certifiers, are paid by property owners. Historically, the number of complaints made against certifiers is relatively small. The Building Professionals Report annually states there's 150 complaints received in 2017 and 2018. Given the size of the sector and the number of building projects undertaken, it's relatively low. In terms of the size of the sector that private certifiers are involved in, my rough guesstimate is it was something like about 49,000 CCs or CDCs. If you need clarification on what they are, please let me know.
Feel free to explode the acronyms for
okay.
Hansard.
Sorry about that.
Yeah.
A CC is a construction certificate that's issued subsequent to the issue of a development consent, and a complying development certificate is a CDC, which is like, the best way to describe it is like a DA and a CC rolled into one for more simplified developments. There were roughly about 47,000 certificates were issued by the private sector last year. In the year 2014, 2015. The data, more recent data, we don't have that available to us yet. The vast majority of certifiers, both private and council, are hard-working, diligent men and women who are carrying out their responsibilities according to the statutory requirements set by people in this building. The continual attacks on the profession generally, regardless of who our employer is, we think, unjustified and unfair. The AAC supports the view of the recently appointed Commissioner that the industry is too self-facing and needs to rebuild its reputation. And once again, I'd like to reinforce the issue of accountability and transparency, key aspects of that reform that we think are fundamental to the process, and we've been advocating that since 2002.
Thanks,
Thank
Mr.
you.
Huddy. Mr. Mace or Mr. Tuxford?
Thank you. On behalf of the board and members of the AIBS, I thank the committee for the opportunity to make a written submission and to appear before this public hearing to represent the profession of building surveying. Building surveyors, or certifiers as they're known in New South Wales, play a crucial role in upholding building standards, and we see part of that role as making a positive contribution to any exercise that aims to improve the system of building regulation. That of course includes this inquiry. The community lacks confidence in our current system of building regulation, and that is why we're all here today. For our part, we intend to be part of the solution of the current issues the committee is inquiring into. Why does the system need fixing? Well, over the years, governments have introduced measures to cut red tape and entered into free trade agreements with other countries. This has led to a greater variety of building products in the marketplace. As is readily evident in a number of our cities across the country, the landscape of the built environment has changed significantly in recent times. These and other changes have brought all kinds of issues for all building practitioners. AIBS has held the position for many years that a complete overhaul of Australia's building regulations is necessary to keep pace with the changes actually occurring within the industry. In most jurisdictions, the systems of regulation currently in place have been there for several decades. There have been amendments along the way to address points of concern, and in several jurisdictions, the regulatory system, in fact, resembles a patchwork of amendments rather than a cohesive system of deliberate design. The structures established in this way are often not capable of dealing with the contemporary building and construction industry. They actually lack the essential rigour to properly provide safe, compliant buildings. We note also that the title of this inquiry and the terms of reference relate to building standards. We expect this does not refer to the technical documents that are produced by standards writing bodies such as Standards Australia and the Australian Building Codes Board, rather that you're referencing the degree of satisfaction with work performed, a matter associated with building quality. We note that by far the majority of building disputes relates to matters of contract between a builder and their client, and outweigh disputes that relate to matters of conformity with mandated technical requirements. The lack of confidence in Australia's building regulations has led to the now well-documented crisis in the availability and viability of compulsory professional indemnity insurance for building surveyors across the country. It is a clear sign that insurers have little confidence in the current regulatory system and the quality of buildings, a fact confirmed recently by insurers in London. Worse still, we are aware that the few insurers still in the Australian market are saying they intend to reduce their exposure around cover for buildings over 3 stories. This will have a serious impact, especially for apartment owners. Building surveyor or certifier. Only in New South Wales, the ACT in Queensland is the term certifier used for what is actually a qualification in building surveying. This causes great confusion amongst lay people in the different jurisdictions about what a certifier might do compared to a building surveyor. It also confuses a building surveyor with completely different role of organisations that certify building products as complying with the Australian standards. For this reason, AIBS has asked the Building Ministers Forum to agree to adopt the title of statutory building surveyor to alleviate existing confusion about the function of building surveyors in the approval, inspection and occupancy verification process. The role of a building surveyor is a statutory one defined in legislation. A key role is to ensure that a building complies with the technical requirements set out in the National Construction Code, which is overseen by the Australian Building Codes Board. Building surveyors acting in their statutory role are often accused of failing in their duties when all kinds of building defects occur. It is of great concern to us that some governments have allowed such criticisms to circulate, particularly where there has been a misconception of the responsibility of a statutory building surveyor's role in preventing a defect that has given rise to a dispute. Building surveyors are not on site every day. We cannot be present on site at all times because legislation does not provide for this. The sheer numbers of products, complexity of materials, construction system and services that go into buildings make visual detection of non-conforming products near impossible for almost all of these items. The true responsibility for compliance rests with the person undertaking the work, and there needs to be much greater accountability for all in the building supply chain. There are no viable alternatives to private involvement in this process, so it makes sense to have in place strong controls about statutory building surveying roles. The local government sector remains a service provider in New South Wales, as with other jurisdictions in Australia. The capacity of the local government sector to deliver certification services is limited. We know that the issues relating to certification are not just the responsibility of government. Industry must also take responsibility to raise the standards of the profession and continue and contribute to an improved system of building regulation. Our work to develop a professional standard scheme for building surveyors is well advanced, and we expect this scheme will provide increased consumer protection and raise the standards of our profession immeasurably. A professional standard scheme will further establish the competencies and skills required of a building surveyor, which as it is now vary from state to state and in some jurisdictions are not clearly defined. Thank you again for this opportunity to appear before this committee. We hope through our submissions and our recommendations we can make a positive contribution to addressing the issues related to the terms of reference in this inquiry.
Well, thank you all for that, and thank you for your detailed submissions in advance. I'll go to the opposition first.
Yeah, so I'll open up. Thanks very much for your time and for your submissions, as the Chair said. I just wanted to take you to the first recommendation of Shergold Weir, which was a system of registration for a number of different professionals across the construction supply chain, and really to, I guess, get your thoughts on what is the role of a duty of responsibility across the supply chain. Is it fair to characterise that the certifiers are the ones left holding the can?
I can say yes. I firmly believe that. I've been a strong advocate for what I mentioned earlier, that if you want to participate in the building game and you bring your skills to the game, you should be accountable for what you do, but it should be in a transparent process, which means that members of the public, who, it's pushed very hard with us when we're doing this training, is that our number one client is the public. If we want to protect the public, it's got to be a transparent system, which means that they should be able to get onto whatever, a portal or a website, and investigate any trade at any time and find out what they're doing, what they've done, what their history is. I might just add that if you look at a certifier's history, we're on a public website that goes back to 2004. So people can learn history about us going back, 15 years. The transparency is not the problem, is not a concern of ours, but we think it should be relative to everybody.
Mr. Tuxford or Mr. Mace, did you want to address that?
Look, I'd agree with what Mr. Hardy has said. The other thing is, as far as the other practitioners and professionals being held accountable, they also need to have adequate training, they need to have adequate ongoing continuous professional development, and they need to have adequate levels of insurance. Anecdotally, we're aware that certifiers in New South Wales are largely joined in proceedings against builders and the like because the certifier carries insurance, whereas few other practitioners or professionals in that group do, or required to have statutory insurance, and that's part of the registration process for certifiers. So we have advocated and strongly pushed for a broadening of those people that require either registration, licensing, and accreditation across the industry.
We had Mr Tansey from the New South Wales Government give us evidence that we didn't need to worry about these other professionals because there's a list of other professionals in the Building Professional Act found in a schedule of that, which includes those giving subdivision certification, private road and drainage, building inspector, swimming pool certification. He pointed out there's a long list of other professionals and paraprofessionals where certification, where people can be certified or be accredited. And he said that because there's that long list, there's nothing to worry about. It's all covered.
Sorry.
Well, I don't know if you can characterise.
Well, what he said was that list is there, that's functioning, that's working, and that provides for certification and for the maintenance of standards. Other witnesses have said nobody uses that list. None of these other paraprofessionals register or get accreditation under that list, and that it's voluntary, and that's a major problem.
If I can maybe put that into a bit of context. The construction of an average house has 162 Australian standards. There's something like 60 plus trades that the department recognises that participate in the recognition or understanding of those standards and implementation. It can't be left to one person to know all 162 standards. It's not possible. These 60 trades need to be, and I don't know whether it's a formal accreditation, but it needs to be under the general term of recognition somehow. They've got to be recognised as people that are experts in their field. It may not be a full accreditation like the BPB scheme, but it may be recognition for lots of other things that happen on building sites by way of a simple licence.
And do you believe they should all then hold their insurance? If they're accredited, then they should hold their own insurance.
I do, 100%.
That alleviate. I'm sorry, Mr. Tuxford.
Oh no, I was just going to go back to the chair's comments. There is a list of other professionals that are accredited through the Building Professionals Board. They don't, for a large part, have the same statutory obligations on them. They're not called up in the legislation to the same extent. So the reliance on those other professionals from an accreditation point of view is a lot less than what it is for building surveyors. The only your E1 certifiers, which are your swimming pool inspectors, they obviously have a function within the Swimming Pools Act and are have responsibilities there, and which are sort of spelt out in that Act.
Inspection, though.
Inspection.
But not construction.
Correct.
Yep.
Correct.
Mr. Tuxford, the view was put to the committee that this was really a potential accreditation, but in practice it didn't really happen in New South Wales. Do you agree with that?
Look, if you go to the list, there's a number of people accredited, but I don't think, as far as the building certifiers would be concerned, that they are able to have certificates coming from those accredited professionals by way of what's known as compliance certificates that would then provide a statutory degree of protection for the building surveyor. They're largely not used. So,
well, can we explore that largely not used part of it? Because that's what we've heard, that there's a potential for people to register and provide certificates under an accreditation scheme, but nobody registers and they're not being used.
Chair, if I may, the original architects of the legislation actually put the right triggers in place. Okay, and one of the main issues has been that the framework that was put in place was never activated correctly. So they saw in the 90s the necessity for anyone involved in the design and engineering to also be accredited. What happened was the A grade, which are the building surveyors, were switched on. However, all the remainder were not. Now, unless you mandate this level of licensing, registration, accreditation, people will not take it up.
Which brings us back to where Ms Hussos started us, that at the end of the day, the private certificators or the principal certifying authority ends up carrying the can because they're the only one with accreditation and professional indemnity insurance, and you're not getting proportionate liability.
That's correct. Because what's happening is we are relying now on certificates from the people that are installing and designing.
But
there's
they're
no
not worth the paper that they're written on, is what
correct. I
we're
mean,
told.
yes, and we agree with that. So we try to create guidelines and try to use the framework of that legislation which was put in place at that time as a ready reckoner to a degree. However, if you can't get a person with a licence number, accreditation number, or the like insurance, then how are you going to hold them accountable? We want people to be able to have a number, be accredited, have insurance, which then it will mean something to them. If they don't have that, they can't price work, they can't do work, whether it's design or whether it's installation and construction.
If it was set up to be a holistic approach with across-the-board accreditation, can you offer any explanations as to why that wasn't activated, and was it just an easy fix to sort of target one particular qualification?
Look, in all honesty, I can't. The reality is the paperwork sits before us. Okay, in 2000, Campbell did the inquiry. The outcome of that was to basically turn everything on.
Well, that was
That
the
was it.
recommendation,
Correct.
but it wasn't the outcome.
No, it wasn't the outcome.
Well, how did politics fail, do you know, at that point? Do you have any observations?
We're very
about-
simple people.
Good
Well,
answer.
we are given a set of rules and we basically go hard against those rules. We are measured by the statutory requirements that are given to us and we try to work within that framework.
How are we?
Can I ask a question? When Campbell delivered, well, when the Campbell report was delivered, was there a response from your organisation to the recommendations that were made? Your organisations, was there a response from your organisations to those recommendations?
We actually didn't exist until 2003.
Oh, right.
So, but in all fairness, Craig was at the inquiry.
Yeah, I made that submission in April 2002, along the lines of what we just discussed, and maybe I've been around too long, but I was sitting at the same tables back then in 2002 discussing the same issues. And the compliance certificate mechanism was a statutory mechanism to provide us with protection for the certificates that we received. But even with that system, that won't cover the 60 plus trades because they're not accredited under that scheme. And I always argue that when I go and look at a house, the head of a nail doesn't tell me much. I don't know how long the nail is, how deep it is, what diameter it is, what it's made of. It doesn't tell me a great deal, and there's probably 1 million of them in the house. So I can't, and people can change things the second I walk away. Now, part of that role is a critical mandatory inspection, which we do, but in many respects, it's not as comprehensive as the person that does the work. I'm not a builder, I'm not a project manager, I don't strap a nail bag on when I go to do these inspections. So I can't tell with 100% confidence that everything, but I can certainly go there and look at it for the glaringly obvious problems, which is the intent of what our statutory role was. It's not too dissimilar to the same role that's been in local government since 1919.
And just on that point, because the most useful thing in your...
Sorry, can I, Mr. Tuxford or Mr. Mates, I'm wondering if, what I'm interested in is, was there pushback within the industry, I suppose, as to the recommendations from Campbell, or did it just sit
Fall
there?
in some other hole.
Yeah.
Look, unfortunately, I wasn't as involved in our institute at that time as I am now. I am confident that we would have put in a submission. I'm confident that we would have been disappointed with the outcome of, not of the Campbell review, but of what was actually put in place. Because we wouldn't be sitting here today if the Campbell recommendations had have been taken up. And we have advocated for a number of the recommendations that are in the Campbell report. So yes, it wouldn't have been pushed back from our industry.
Mr. Hardy.
Yeah, so it's not resistant from your sector.
No.
Yeah.
Just a question to Mr. Hardy. We took evidence, I think last time we sat, it was Monday, a week or so, 2 weeks ago, from the newly appointed building commissioner, that he could tell what was wrong with the building site and the building when he went there. For example, he gave us his rundown after his visit to Mascot Towers. He also, in evidence, said that he didn't need a building commission behind him and that he could do all of this with the existing bureaucracy, and that the certification processes that were in place, obviously by definition, then were adequate or just needed a little bit of tweaking. Have you got any idea or any comments to make in relation to that?
I'm of the view that the solution to this problem is holistic. Everybody who plays in this game needs to be responsible for what they do. Certifiers, and I agree with what Mr. May said earlier, it's a poor choice of language because we don't certify the whole building, and it's not reasonable to expect us to do that because we can't. I believe that the system, as it's outlined in the Act, can work. I think that we need to broaden the issue of accountability in a transparent way. But if we can achieve that, the general framework is pretty much there if we address the issue of accountability.
So the term certification or the title certification is misnomer then?
Yeah, I think it's a bad word. We've long held the view with our association that certification is probably not the best choice of word to represent what we do. It wasn't back in local government. It's probably not now. When you meet someone at a function, they say, "What do you do?" You say, "I'm certified," and they say, "What do you certify? Toasters? What do you certify?"
Sorry,
you go, Mr. Mace.
Mr. Mace?
At the Senate inquiry into non-conforming building products, when we gave evidence there, there was confusion even by those senators on the panel as to the role of certifiers and the confusion with certification of building products and certification of buildings. So it is a quite confusing term for the layperson.
So what's the alternative? Mr. Tuxford, you're going to tell us.
Well, the problem is when certification came in, it took what was then known as building approvals and building permits out of local government. And I think the architects, and this is just sheer speculation, but I think the architects wanted to stay away from using terms that had previously existed within the Local Government Act and therefore looked for another alternative. But I mean, I guess what we are doing, we are giving a permit to build rather than giving a certification as far as the construction certificate. So I mean, the terms that were in place up until that point had been in place for quite some time.
It's a permit to build and then a permit to occupy.
If I might just add there, if you look at the sort of entire system of who's accredited to be a certifier, they're not just building surveyors. This is the hard part that you've got to deal with. There's engineers, there's surveyors, there's a whole range of other persons that are called certifiers within the framework of the BPB. Now, I don't know whether collectively that's the right word. Maybe building professionals is a better word. There may be a number of other options. But I think to generally call us certifiers creates a misconception in the community that I certify everything.
But to get a handle over what is a very complex industry with multiple professions, multiple trades, often competing tensions between profit and quality and public interest, the current architecture is not fit for purpose, is it? Like it's in a variety of different government departments, variety of different sort of partial powers. The current architecture is not fit for purpose, is it?
Look, my question is always, why don't we have a Ministry of Construction?
Yeah. Or a building commission?
Well, that's why I asked the question about building commission.
Look, the building, I have met with the building commissioner, and I might say that his view, and I think his scope is actually very, very broad, okay, in terms of what his charter is going to be. And I think it's going to be a very difficult charter to address properly, given limitations and given the amount of widgets in construction per se. As you say, it is a very complex, and people can't downplay the complexity of construction. So there are different factors, and I think if you do have a homogenous and, as Mr. Hardy said, a holistic approach, then it will take some time, but I think it needs to be brought together a lot better.
Brought together in
That
one
seems
place
disappointing.
under a building commission, which is the recommendation from the Campbell inquiry in 2002, which I thought you said your profession has been supporting for the last 17 years.
If I can go back to the question of Deputy Chair, or maybe I misunderstood where the question was coming from, but we are strong supporters of a building commission, having it all together. If this existing legislative framework, it's probably got the elements here to make it work, but it needs to be under the control of one body.
It just seems to me that that the title certifier or building certifier, whatever, just seems to be the catch-all phrase that if anyone wants to abuse the building industry, a certifier gets the blame.
You're right, and that's
When in
what we
fact
yeah.
you don't have the power, you don't have the scope, you don't have the control, and nobody really understands that you don't certify the whole thing.
And to that question though, because I think you do set out in your submission what you do, what you don't do, and you've reiterated that today. Who is doing the checking though? Who is in charge of? You say it's not the accredited certifier's role to check that the builder or developer has complied with every aspect of the project. Who is checking in New South Wales? Is it happening?
Well, it's pretty clear that there's a failing in those buildings somewhere. Now, who has that responsibility? It just simply cannot be a building certifier that's there for less than 0.5% of construction time.
Yeah.
Well, we know
But
certifiers aren't checking, but Mr. Graham's question is
Your question is who is?
Yeah.
It has to be the builder or the project manager or his appointed person.
Yeah, my question though is the system at the moment, that checking really isn't happening. That's what you're saying to us?
Independent of the builder.
Sorry, that's correct. I'll insist.
Yeah.
The traditional method was to have on larger, more complex buildings, you had clerk of works, and you had an independent person that effectively inspected and was on site the whole time of construction.
Yeah, so that was the old system?
That is, let's say, the old system.
Yeah.
Was it a bad system? Well, it's like every system has pros and cons.
Yeah.
But it did have that level of independence, which actually took up the gap where we sit.
Yeah.
We sample the buildings.
And your position today is...
Sorry, can I just ask?
Sure.
Because you said it has pros and cons. Can you tell me what you identify? I can guess what the pros are, but can you identify what the cons of the clerk of work system was?
Cost.
But
Commercial cost was one of them.
But we've had evidence to say the cost of a clerk of works for a year is less than the cost of one day in court.
I do not dispute that.
So if you're looking at cost benefits on this,
Only if you go to court.
cost is, in the scheme of complex multi-storey buildings, the cost of a clerk of works, in terms of the economic cost to a unit holder to buy a property at the end of the day, is minuscule, isn't it?
So can I just ask there, I don't want to make speeches, but I'll leave that to others. But it seems to
That's the
me,
beginning of his speech.
if there is an appetite for a clerk of work system, then you would have to identify a scale of construction that would justify the requirement for a clerk of works. So you wouldn't require it on a residential property, for instance.
No, of course.
So where is, if there is that con of cost, where is the...
Sweet spot.
Yeah, the sweet spot, yeah.
Look, I mean, it's a little bit outside our purview in terms of what we do. We're not close enough to that. But there are other legislatures internationally that do have this similar type of system where I think they grade independent review and engineers on the basis of size of projects, etc.
The UK, for example.
Possibly the UK, I'm not sure. I think I've come across it in, maybe in Singapore, for instance.
Right.
But it's I was just going to say it's an interesting proposition because it's actually something that we identified in the Senate inquiry, and a number of people also put that same position forward.
I'm not putting forward a position. I'm just
No, but I'm just saying. But that is what a number of people have put forward, is the idea of a clerk of works. And what it does is, again, it's a matter of going back in history. A clerk of works was in place, I think, up until the mid-80s. Then you had certification sort of come in. Clerk of works had already gone. Clerk of works were there to protect the owners and were there to protect the architects. They were employed by the architects to sort of help supervise the work. The other thing you've got to look at between that time and now is the completely different built environment that we're dealing with. A clerk of works at that time would have only been on most probably a number of your high-rise jobs, so had a proper place to be. We most probably need one more now because there's a lot more products involved. There's a lot more complexity into the building industry, and you drive through this city and you just see cranes everywhere. I mean, and that's good, but it's very different to how it was when a clerk of works was in place and a clerk of works, went by the wayside.
So you're actually saying that the demand for that sort of holistic oversight is actually increased as a result of the modern form and the quantity of building that's gone on in Sydney?
I would think so. I would think there would be. It's a quality assurance. That's what the Clerk of Works was. He was a quality assurance.
If I might just add, if I could add to that too, I wouldn't limit this just to complex buildings because there are, many buildings at a residential level constructed in this state where you need adequate supervision as well. And you might have one person, you don't have one person per job, but you might have one supervisor that looks after 10 jobs. Is that appropriate? One supervisor looking after 20 jobs or 30 jobs. The thinner you spread him, the less quality you've got over the build.
Yeah, and there can be quite complex individual residential properties. Mr. Tuxford,
There can be in some areas.
I know that you're
Chair.
from Wallara Council, and I can think of some major excavation works and the like. Or we had the same said about Manly Council and some of the complex issues for individual properties in those.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Indeed, I went, strangely, for a ferry ride up the, where did I go? Anyway, way up the Parramatta River on the weekend, and what struck me was the townhouse developments, which whilst they don't have the complexity of some of the high-rise, the scale of the development itself is extraordinary. And so whilst you might not get the complexity issue, the value that's being stacked up is extraordinary in those projects. And if they're all built badly, it's a hell of a disaster.
It's quantum, right? It's just volume.
In some way, yeah.
But there's a number of trigger points. It's not just above 3 stories. There's a number of trigger points.
That's what I originally
I
thought,
think
yeah.
I would say it's something that would need to be looked at in more detail, to try and find where is the place to bring them in. But it's there would seem to be that there's not adequate on-site supervision across the board, and I guess that's what a Clerk of Works would provide you. I was just going to go back and make a point because
Can you go away and give us your considered view as to where those trigger points are?
Not right now.
Take it away.
On notice, I think.
No, you guys, settle a lot of the responsibility.
we can give
whether
it
you
some
like or not.
consideration.
And obviously the insurance and how that all trickles through is very important, but where you think the trigger points are, because it's been put to us, maybe it should be just where home warranty insurance ends, and there are some issues there. The complexity of the building you've mentioned, and other factors that might be relevant. I think it would be useful for us to understand your view on this.
Okay, and we can take that on board.
Notice.
Yep. The point I was going to
I'm
make...
sorry, that's a request to both organisations. Mr. Hardy, would you be happy to consider that as well?
More than happy.
Thank you.
And also just any views about the potential cost implications. You may or may not be able to really go into detail on that, but I think that's...
We can ask
attention to
industry. We
that.
can ask some parts of industry to assist.
Could I say, just on cost, we advocated when they introduced the 2% strata bond. We highlighted in our submission in relation to that you were fixing the wrong end of the process. That money would have been better invested sort of at the front end, sort of all through the process, to give an assurance of what was going to be a quality build, rather than having a safeguard at the end where you're trying to retrospectively make something a quality build.
It's not even an ambulance at the bottom of the cliff. It's a stretcher at the bottom of the cliff, isn't it?
Yep.
Just one question in terms of the Clerk of Works. With a Clerk of Works system, where would accredited certifiers fit into
I
that
don't think
system?
our role changes. It's a statutory role that's well documented in the legislation. I think that continues. What we're talking about here is an added layer of protection for consumers at a site level. Because I always say this, we're there for such a short period of time fulfilling that statutory role. When we walk away, people can hide anything, anytime, any place. But we need someone who's accountable for that on site.
But it's
So Tuxford, is that your view as well, or I think Mr. Tuxford just wanted to...
Yeah,
contribute as well?
that's right. I think, as Mr. Hardy said, you've got to look at the critical stage inspections that are identified currently in the legislation, which most probably need to be looked at. But we're most probably undertaking an audit role in the building process, and it is a very small audit role, and that role would still continue with the Clerk of Works. It always has, because it again provides just another layer, but it helps you give assurance that things are at least on track.
Can I just add,
but
sorry?
essentially you're
We'll let
arguing...
Mr. Marinelli
Sorry.
add, and then go to you, Mark.
Yeah, apologies, sorry. Just on the back of that, the Clerk of Works is measuring against the contract. So he was measuring the builder against the contract in terms of quality, fit for purpose, all the other stuff. And that's where I said there's a gap between what we do in terms of just sampling, making sure it's going in the right direction, and the bits in between were taken up by the likes of an independent like a Clerk of Works. And that was the framework which basically the builders were working with as well. And that accountability then dovetailed back into the owner, making sure he was getting a building to that quality, etc.
And that's what's missing now.
I think so.
Mr. Buttigieg.
But you're not, to make the point, you're not putting all the emphasis on resurrecting a Clerk of Works as a solution for all of this. This is just one plank of an overall strategy which requires each contribution, each input to the building, each trade, each professional to actually have a vested interest and incentive to comply based on the regulatory oversight.
Can I just jump on the back of that, because that is very much where I want to head. They're almost, how do those two things fit together? Because one's almost top-down supervision, the other one is really
Standards.
everyone building up through the system, taking responsibility for what they're doing. It's more of a bottom-up system coming to the certifier. How do they, which is more important? Do you need them both?
You need them both.
Yeah.
Right, there's no question you do need them both, because what you've got is if you've got a regulatory framework which is sampling and relying on the people that are installing, a lot of the contracts also require warranties in terms of the installed form. Okay, so the contract will require the person that installed the electrical system to give a sign-off and a certification. Okay, the waterproofer to do the same, the glazier to do the same. So all we're saying is you need to formalise that. You need to make it hard. And what it will also do, it will lift quality, because the guys that are vested in it will be accredited, will be licensed to that degree, will have insurance, and then will be competing on a good quality level.
Well, in fact, the evidence before
sorry,
was they might be accredited or they might
I think we might
not
go to
be.
the balance of the panel at this point and then come back to you to answer that question.
Yeah, we would agree with what Mr. Marinelli has said. You would still require all the licensing, accreditation, insurance for all those other. I mean, the Clerk of Works would not be the panacea. The Clerk of Works would provide greater assistance in getting a quality outcome, all being well. But there are. Again, you can't expect that the Clerk of Works is going to be on every part of a particular job, on every. So, the people who have got skin in the game have to have some responsibility in it as well, and that's also key.
And when they produce substandard work or issue an inappropriate certificate, they can be held to account.
They have to be held to account.
Mr Tuxford, we have had evidence under the current regime, the way build and construct is being run, certainly in New South Wales these days, that a construction process could begin before there's even a finalised set of plans for the building, and that quite often in certain situations, maybe it happens in every situation, I don't know, that the builder himself won't even finalise the detail. It'll be left to the subcontractor. How does that fit with your model of certification then?
Well, I mean that's one of the areas that are being looked at the moment through the government's review of the Shergold-Weir report. There is, as it stands at the moment, the quality of documentation is most probably poor. The quality of documentation that is most probably...
And that's exactly where I was getting to, because by the time the building's up, even though you may have a certifier working through the process or someone actually looking at quality as you go, what set of plans, what sort of specs are we actually looking at? And when we get to the end, is there actually a, let's use an old-fashioned term, a blueprint for the whole building in its final form?
As built.
As built. Look, I don't believe... Again, we're talking complex and larger scale.
That's all the more reason if you design a submarine, you want to make sure it doesn't leak.
That's exactly right. And there most probably isn't as it stands at the moment. Given the way that things sort of develop and process, you might start off with an approved set of plans that'll have things saying, to Australian standard, blah. It won't necessarily have the detail of how they're going to do the wet areas. So you can't give your set of plans or the details to your wet area installer and say, well, this is what you expect. It's being left to him to go and put in the wet areas. So that was one of the shortcomings identified by Shergold Weir, the quality of documentation. It would most probably add some time to the process. I mean, obviously the reduction in red tape has always been been key for some jurisdictions. But again,
Especially in this jurisdiction.
if you're getting a better outcome, you know, it's most probably what's important.
Some people have suggested that online contemporaneous recording of all of this is an essential end goal to to the reform, so that as design work is being done, that's entered contemporaneously on an online portal. What do you say to that?
Look, I would think we need to be using the technology that we have. There should be no reason why a lot of this stuff isn't online, so that it is accessible to a variety of agencies. And that goes not just to design and construction, it goes to all the other products that are involved in the construction industry. You know, there should be a centralised repository for this type of information.
Well, there's the planning portal.
Advises that if it's, whether it's in hard form or whether it's online, who's responsible during the project, do you say, for ensuring that that is done?
Well, I would be thinking that...
Help me, yeah. I was about to say that, yeah. There's obviously two levels of degree of complexity with these jobs. The residential level, design and construct doesn't happen. You know, if they build works before they're approved, the construction certificate has no effect in the legislation. So they just can't do that. When it comes to more complex jobs, things happen very quickly on site and they're adapted quite quickly. And Rob does a lot more work in high-rise than what I do. But I think you'd say, Rob, that the complexity of the process might make that a little bit impractical to do. What is important is that these contemporaneous notes are available upon request, but we have a board now that can come in and take a look at our files anytime any problems come to their attention. They can go into Rob's office and say, let me see your contemporaneous notes, let me see your files. So they're all there. But if you go to a building site where you've got complex things happening, you know, at 1,000,000 miles an hour, I don't know how practical it's going to be to get all that stuff back, then put it all on the portal. And I'm a big advocate of the portal. I've been pushing it in the government in many other places. But I just don't know if it's as practical as that for complex projects.
Well, that's sort of my concern. You can say that all these things are a good idea, but if actually it doesn't reflect
The process.
what's
It's
achievable, then we just create, in a sense,
another inefficiency.
Yeah.
well,
With
not only
subject.
an inefficiency, you create a misconception of what's occurred. You create
The thing is also you do want integrity in terms of what gets uploaded. You want correct information getting uploaded. You want due regard given to the documentation which is compiled, which is correct. So in the process that we take, we do get drawings that maybe not incomplete, and that's done for a reason in that we then review, assist, highlight what the non-conformances are, and there's a process of toing and froing. And that's the real process in terms of larger projects and still small projects as well. So when you've got that, it isn't a case of that immediateness of uploading. The importance of uploading, say, the construction certificate or the building approval, the complying development certificate once it's issued, there is no question. Once there's a line in the sand, it has been assessed, then it should be uploaded.
But by the time you've got a building built, there should be, in one place, accessible to future owners or insurers, a comprehensive set of as-built plans,
Correct.
which identifies all of those decisions.
That's correct, that's fine. And it can be done, but you need to pick the right triggers and events which can inform you correctly along the way.
And the only suggested architecture that anyone's put forward is the current planning portal, which is being rolled out for DAs across New South Wales, and you could attach this to that planning portal.
Which is what we said.
Yeah.
We've been strong advocates for a long time about a certification portal, not too dissimilar to it, where the relevant people that participate and they go and register their certificates, they're known persons, recognised persons, they submit the certificate that goes into the portal, and that's transparent for everybody to see at the end of the day.
Well, that's the certificates.
Yeah.
But what else is uploaded?
Well, you'd have
the
things like
drawings.
construction certificates relating to different methods of construction, and the occupation certificate.
And once we bring those other professions and trades on board, if that's where we're going,
Yep.
those certificates and design work as well being uploaded as well.
In a prescribed form, in a prescribed manner.
And that's the critical issue, in a prescribed form, in a prescribed manner, because otherwise you'll end up with a PDF version of something online that's got 1,500 pages that's going to be of no value to anyone. So, I mean, we know the way that it should look, we know the way that it should work. How you actually construct that is most probably, it needs some more workshopping with relevant parties, people that are sort of, smarter on IT than what I would necessarily be. But you know that at the end of the day, what you want is to be able to have something that is online and readily accessible, and you can actually use the data.
And the hard copy documents that would have been floating around the site, what's to happen to those? Like, I understand, it's sort of the variation on this, is that if all these documents end up frittered around between various offices, what happens to them?
Digital media's really changed that a lot. There's a lot of stuff which is now electronic. Okay, so the guys on site, they might be printing drawings or parts of the construction, but it's not really, I think, the way a lot of the larger sites are working. The guys do have a lot of information available electronically. I just want to go back a little bit in terms of these triggers. If you look at the construction certificate requirements, the building permit has attached to it all the documentation that we've relied on in order to issue that approval. Now that means drawings, specifications, the certificates from the designers, etc., and it's the same at the back end, and that is prescribed by the legislation. So you have a package which basically gives you a very transparent transposition of everything that's occurred. Okay, so to dovetail in and to take what Tim was saying, to dovetail in and put appropriate certificates by appropriate people which are accredited within that will only bolster that system.
But where are
Particularly when the construction certificate, we heard from the architects, those drawings are often very partial, sometimes only 10, 20, 30, 40% of the complexity. We need to fill in the rest of it to have an as built.
They can, and that's one of the threshold problems. It's how much information do you take? Because as an approval authority, we're looking for enough information on the documentation that they can build to it. But attached to that is also the structural design, the electric design, all the other parts that form the building itself. Now, there is a capability. Design and construct is very difficult because it is very fast. And the truth being told, and my opinion is, there are a lot of builders out there under a lot of pressure, right? And things are moving very, very fast, and they're just getting faster and faster. So these guys are feeling the pressure of that, and that gets pushed down to subcontractors, to delivery, all that sort of stuff.
And under the current system, that complexity of documents that follow the construction certificate, there's no one place it's kept, there's no clear statutory requirement to keep it, there's no registration, and there's therefore, in some cases, there's big black holes, and that's a problem.
No, sorry, Mr. Chair. The repository is council and our office, so we have a 10-year requirement to keep all documentation. Okay, so we do have the documentation as certifiers.
And council.
And a copy goes to council. If we're doing work for the ministry gets a copy as well. So there is a repository, and it can be USB or hard copy, etc. However, to put it into a portal, readily available, greater level of transparency, we don't think that's an issue. We think that's actually probably a very good thing. And that can keep us informed because we do rely on that documentation of the past to work on buildings on an ongoing basis.
Ms. Hughes.
When you say we keep it, you mean you as the individual certifier?
I, as the individual certifier, am compelled and required by legislation to maintain those documents for 10 years.
Okay, because we have received evidence in this inquiry that getting access to those documents was incredibly difficult for homeowners, for consumers themselves.
We've heard evidence of a 10-year struggle to get as-built plans, for example.
The issue might be whether council has kept the drawings, because everything should be lodged with council. That's usually the archive of last resort. The certifier doesn't necessarily give out information. Okay.
So there's no obligation. So the obligation is on you to retain the information, but not necessarily to provide it to people in the future.
The BPB has jurisdiction to tell us.
Yeah,
to do
but
that.
if
So
you're an individual
from
unit
a
holder,
consumer.
if you're an injured unit holder,
Yes.
you're having a problem with your strata about maybe the waterproofing, there's no obligation on private certifiers to provide them the as-built documentation.
Directly, but we're compelled under the legislation to give it to the council, and that information's available to the council.
So as the legislation's currently constructed, the council is the keeper of the records.
Correct.
So within 2 days of issuing of a construction certificate, that's to be lodged with the council, and within 2 days of issuing an occupation certificate,
It goes to
that's to be
council.
lodged with the council as well. Now, and then the council would have their protocols with how they would release that information.
I'm interested in this idea of, I opened by saying you're left holding the can. In reality, it's the consumer that's being left holding the can at the end of this process. I'm interested in ways that we can give them more information to become more informed consumers. Do you have any ideas around that?
Well, I believe the portal's the first step, but the council being the repository of all information, there's no better step if council makes that information available.
Do you think, for example, that consumers should have free access to building codes and building standards?
Oh, they do to the building code now.
Yeah, it's available now on the web, yeah.
Building standards?
You
The
do.
Australian standards are supported. Not generally, even we don't, we have to purchase those. So you can get the BCA for free, but we have contracts to download the standards when we need them.
Taking on Australian standards is a whole new, outside of beyond this inquiry, Courtney.
Sorry, is 10 years, is 10
Sorry.
years long enough? I'm just thinking of Mascot, for instance. Some of these problems aren't going to become obvious within the time frame. 10 years is still a relatively young building.
I think in hindsight, look, that's up for grabs. I think putting the documentation in the public arena will, give it longer longevity.
Accepting that you've got documents now, even if you go to a portal, that's all well and good going forward. The
Yes.
question is, in terms of that repository of documentation that you've got going now, you could be next week throwing into a skip bin, and I'm not being critical, but throwing into a skip bin 10-year-old or 11-year-old documents simply because you don't have enough filing space.
But at the end of the day, the council still is the repository.
The council would still have the documentation.
They have to have the same documents.
Mr. Hardy, Mr. Marinelli, one of the issues that's been raised about private certifiers is that even if there's a rogue certifier, they're struck off by the board, that they can remain in the industry, perhaps as the CEO or the general manager of a certification company, continue to set the tone for that corporation, but employ other private certifiers under them. And I can think of a couple of notorious cases where that's happening. Is that a problem?
It's very hard to comment from the outside looking in because I'm not involved in management practices with those companies. But if you see a continuation of the same practices, I'd be concerned by that.
Mr. Marinelli?
Totally agree.
So if somebody is struck off by the board, surely there should be a prohibition from continuing engagement in the industry, rather than just you can't be a certifier.
Well,
But you can't do the work of a private certifier. Sure, there should be a prohibition from being associated with a company or a business or an undertaking that does private certification work.
I think it's a very difficult call to make that because people train and study all their years, and they may have been struck off, because that can happen for lots of reasons. For not, we see a number of issues where they get, accused of doing.
Well, no, that's not accused. We're talking about found guilty of serious professional misconduct. That's what we're talking about, Mr. Hardy.
Found guilty of that. But is it fair to take their whole livelihood away as a building surveyor, not a certifier, but as a building surveyor working somewhere else?
Well, but fairness needs to be in the context of protecting public safety and the public interest. So we don't regulate just for the fairness of somebody's ongoing income, but to protect standards.
If they're involved in accreditation, I would agree with you.
Marinelli? And then I'll go to Mr. Mason Cox.
I think there's enough structure in the legislation in terms of disciplinary that if you have a concern with an ongoing issue like that, there's enough teeth for the BPB to then investigate the organisation that they are still running. And that is the litmus test as to whether they have changed in the way that they practice. If they haven't, well then that should be reflected in the way that they're audited and observed over a period of time, if that is a concern.
Mr. Mason Cox.
Just quickly, I know time is running out. In relation to insurance, I wanted to particularly understand from the building surveyor's perspective, and gentlemen, you as well, naturally, in terms of the regulation change that occurred to exclude cladding, if you like, from PI insurance to enable registration to alleviate some of the problems in the market. Has it been successful? I just wanted some feedback on that, whether there's anything else you think is necessary in the short term, and any other suggestions you have in relation to the government in terms of action it should take to address the current problems.
I guess it comes down to what is successful. Has it allowed people to continue to practice? Yes. However, they continue to practice under very difficult circumstances. Greater exposure and the viability of whether they can continue to do that, but they are carrying a lot more exposure than what they would have normally done. As to whether that will continue, it depends on, given that the issue around PI insurance relates to increases in premiums and increases in excesses. Excess is the big thing at the moment, because you can have somebody who is registered practicing and they've got excesses of 100, 200,000, one or two claims, whether they're responsible or not, they're out of business. So time will tell, as more and more claims come in, whether that's able to be sustained, whether you're going to have enough building surveyors staying in business to be able to sustain that level of claims and that level of exposure.
And particularly,
Can I just ask?
Well, we have run out of time, so I've got Ms. Hughes wants to ask one final question. So can we just make this quick?
okay, just on the fact that we have a claims-made policy system and the excluding of cladding and moving down the track, just a quick comment, and perhaps you can take this on notice, in relation to dealing with the overhang from cladding of buildings currently in the marketplace and the implications of that in relation to insurance, given we have a claims-made policy arrangement and the exclusion of those cladding clad buildings, potential liability that attaches there too, the impact of that as an overhang on the market.
Okay.
You could take that on notice within 7 days. Trevor, did you have something quickly?
No.
Just one final question. And we've talked a lot about the gap between the public perception of what a certifier does and what you're actually able to deliver. Can you just tell us how much time does a certifier spend on site as part of the construction build,
For a residential dwelling,
on average?
less than 1%, probably closer to 0.5% of construction time.
0.5% of construction time.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. It's a very
Which
small amount.
emphasises where we started. Getting private certification to work is important, but it's hardly going to fix the series of problems that we see on building sites and building qualities. I think on behalf of the committee, I thank you all for your evidence today and your submissions. There are a number of questions that I think have been taken on notice. The Secretariat will help you identify what those questions are, and we'd ask if you could provide those within 7 days, because we want to issue an interim report. Thanks again.
Chair, members, thank you very much.